When the Pokemon TCG first started with base set in 1999, 7 types of Pokemon were introduced to the game. Water, Fire, Grass, Lightning, Psychic, Fighting, and Colorless built the foundation of the TCG. But since then, more types have been added, the first 2 being Metal and Darkness at the end of 2000 in Neo Genesis. Since their introduction, the Darkness type has become one of the strongest types in the Pokemon TCG, and today we're going to look at 10 of the best Darkness type Pokemon ever printed. Starting off at number 10, we have Rocket Sneasel EX from EX Team Rocket Returns. Its Drag-Off attack deals 10 damage for 1 Darkness Energy, but before doing damage you get to switch your opponent's active Pokemon with one of their bench Pokemon, and the damage is then dealt to that new active Pokemon. For 2 Darkness Energies and 1 Colorless, its Dark Ring attack deals 30 damage, plus 10 more for each of your Darkness type Pokemon in play. By today's standards, Rocket Sneasel EX looks absolutely unplayable with its 90 HP and low damage output for the 3 energies, especially when you consider that it gives up 2 prize cards when knocked out. But if we take a closer look, it becomes much better. First and foremost, Rocket Sneasel EX was released almost 20 years ago in 2004, putting it into a completely different side of the game than it is today. Back then, most Pokemon required a lot of energies just to potentially get 2-hit knockouts. Dealing around 50 damage for 3 or more energies was common at the time. So even with its ×2 weakness to fighting, Rocket Sneasel EX can oftentimes survive more than 1 hit. This also puts Dark Ring into a different perspective, as it's able to deal up to 90 damage when having a board of only Darkness type Pokemon. This is only the beginning of Rocket Sneasel EX's power. The EX Team Rocket Returns expansion brought many support cards of Pokemon that were either Dark or Team Rocket Pokemon. One major drawback that Darkness type Pokemon had back in the day, up until Diamond and Pearl, was that they actually didn't have a basic energy for their type. Instead, they had Special Darkness Energy, an energy card that provides a Darkness type Pokemon it's attached to with 1 Darkness Energy and adds 10 damage to any of its attacks. With this stacking effect, Darkness type Pokemon were able to quickly deal a lot of damage. In Rocket Sneasel EX, this means that even with just itself in play and 2 special Darkness Energies attached to it, Dark Ring already deals 60 damage. Only having 4 energies for its typing could cause issues at times, especially when having to be attached manually. This is where 3 specific cards from EX Team Rocket Returns come in to lift Rocket Sneasel EX from being good to absolutely insane. Our energy provides the Dark, or Rocket's Pokemon with 2 Darkness Energies, and increases its damage done by 10, but gets discarded at the end of your turn. Dark Electrode could accelerate energies with its Darkness Navigation Pokepower, which lets you attach a Darkness or Darkness Metal energy from your deck to it once per turn. Having an energy in Dark Electrode wasn't that helpful for Rocket Sneasel EX to use its attack, which is why Dark Dragonite is the final piece of this combo. Its Dark Trance ability lets you move a Darkness energy from one of your Pokemon to a different one. Its incredible attack and access to some of the most powerful consistency tools at the time make Rocket Sneasel EX one of the best Darkness types ever, especially when considering that it came out almost 20 years ago. And at number 9, we have Yveltal EX from XY. For 1 Colorless and 1 Darkness Energy, Evil Ball deals 20 damage plus 20 more for each energy attached to both active Pokemon. For 1 Darkness Energy and 2 Colorless, its Y Cyclone attack deals 90 damage, and you have to move an energy from this Pokemon to one of your bench Pokemon, unless you have none. Yveltal EX's damage output was already very solid at the time, but the access to some of the best Darkness type Pokemon at the time helped it with immediately having an impact on the metagame. Dark Patch from Dark Explorers is an item card that attaches a Darkness energy from your discard pile to one of your bench Pokemon, helping with quickly powering up Yveltal EX or various other attackers. Yveltal's from XY's Oblivion Wings attacks deals 30 damage for 1 Darkness Energy and lets you attach a Darkness Energy card from discard pile to one of your bench Pokemon. This didn't just help with setup attacks, just like Dark Patch, but also allowed for some early chip damage that would then make it easier for your big attackers to pick up knockouts. Lastly, Darkrai EX from Dark Explorers provided the deck with great utility through its Dark Cloak ability, which makes the retreat cost of every Pokemon with Darkness Energy attached to it 0. It also has a great attack in Night Spear, which deals 90 damage for 2 Darkness and 1 Colorless Energy, and does 30 damage to one of your opponent's other Pokemon. Those powerful Darkness type cards were already a great core for the deck itself, but additional damage modifiers and access to double Colorless Energy helped the deck establish itself as one of the best decks at the time. While it was primarily a very aggressive deck, Yveltal was also able to shine as a more control type deck. Garbodor from Dragon's Exalted, with its Garbotoxin ability that blocks abilities for as long as Tool card is attached to it, helped Yveltal EX decks to slow down their opponents, while Evil Ball and Y Cyclone helped with overwhelming your opponent. For a long period, this was the most popular version of the deck, leading to it dominating the 2014 World Championships, but being stopped in the top 8. The next season was a similar story, but due to the 2014/2015 rotation, the deck lost access to Dark Patch. The deck now had to adapt and change into a more of a control type deck, which it remained as until the very end before it itself rotated in 2017. But not before completely dominating the 2016/2017 season as the best deck, establishing itself as one of the best stacks and cards in the history of the Pokemon TCG. And at number 8, we've got Eternatus VMAX from Sword and Shield Darkness Ablaze. Its Eternal Zone ability lets you have up to 8 Pokemon on your bench, as long as all of them were Darkness-type Pokemon. Dread End deals 30 damage for each Darkness-type Pokemon you have in play, and requires 1 Darkness and 1 Colorless energy. Up to this day, it's also the Pokemon with the biggest HP ever printed, with an astonishing 340 HP. The goal that Eternatus VMAX is trying to achieve is pretty simple. Fill up your bench quickly with Darkness-type Pokemon to deal enough damage to knock out basically anything in a single hit. Even when the 270 regular damage cap wasn't enough, various damage modifiers allowed it to even deal enough to knock out other VMAX Pokemon with more than 300 HP. The most beneficial Pokemon for the strategy was Galarian Zigzagoon from Sword and Shield. When put into play, its Headbutt Tantrum ability lets you place 1 damage counter on one of your opponent's Pokemon. Due to its massive bench size, Eternatus VMAX could easily bench up to 4 of them and reuse them with Scoop Up Net. An item card lets you put a non-V Pokemon from your bench back into your hand. Eternatus VMAX also had access to great consistency Pokemon in Crobat V from Darkness Ablaze. When you put into play, Crobat V's Dark Acid ability lets you draw until you have 6 cards in hand, but it can only be used once per turn, so that decks like Eternatus VMAX can't bench 4 Crobat V to draw their entire deck on their first turn. For the most part, those were the only Pokemon the deck was playing. Some exceptions being 1 prize attackers to give your opponent a harder time in winning. Usually they simply consisted of 4 Crobat V, 4 Galarian Zigzagoon, 4 Eternatus V, and 4 Eternatus VMAX alongside energies and trainer cards, making this deck not just powerful and incredibly dominant at the time, but also very easy to pilot. Aside from its weakness to fighting type Pokemon, Eternatus VMAX was incredibly hard to beat, especially since Eternatus V's Power Accelerator attack lets you deal 30 damage for 1 colorless energy, and attaches a Darkness energy from your hand to one of your bench Pokemon, helping the deck to play around potential energy disruption. As the game developed further, many great fighting type Pokemon were introduced to the game, but somehow Eternatus VMAX managed to stick around for the largest part, until eventually dealing 270 damage to V-Star Pokemon with 208 HP, with only giving up 2 prize cards when knocked out. Funnily enough, shortly before its rotation in March of 2023, it made a comeback alongside another card that rotated at the time, Galarian Weezing from Sword and Shield. Its Neutralizing Gas ability prevents your opponent from using any abilities as long as it's in the active spot, and Severe Poison applies poison for 1 darkness energy, but instead of 1 damage counter between turns, the poison puts 4. Galarian Weezing was a great card with many power ability based decks in the format, and Eternatus VMAX made sure that you had a bigger attacker to deal with threats where Galarian Weezing by itself is not enough. It even managed to win one of the last regional championships that it was legal for, ending its existence in Pokémon TCG on a high note. While it might not have been as dominating as Yveltal EX, which to be fair was largely caused to losing most of its dominance to the pandemic, the fact that it was able to warp an entire format establishes it as one of the best Darkness-type Pokemon of all time. And at number 7, we have Spiritomb from Platinum Arceus. The notable thing about Spiritomb was its special ability, Keystone Seal, which prevents both players from playing item cards as long as it's in your active spot. This made Spiritomb an excellent floodgate that stopped your opponent from playing just long enough to set up other strategies, since you could just swap out Spiritomb back to the bench in order to turn off its item lock. This item lock could even be comboed with Gengar from Diamond and Pearl Storefront with its Poltergeist attack, which dealt 30 damage times the number of trainer cards in your opponent's hand. If your opponent couldn't use their item cards, then chances are they'd have a lot of them in their hand when Gengar finally came out and started blasting. And with how easily this card set up an item lock being a basic Pokemon and not having to wait for a stage 2 like Vileplume did, this made it all too easy of a floodgate to take full advantage of and was quite the menace on the competitive scene when it was still in rotation. And at number 6 we have Darkrai EX from Black and White Dark Explorers. Its Dark Cloak ability makes the retreat cost of each of your Pokemon that has a Darkness energy attached to it 0. Night Spear requires 2 Darkness energy and 1 colorless, and deals 90 damage plus 30 to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. As previously mentioned, when we talked about Yveltal EX, Dark Explorers brought a bunch of great Darkness type specific support like the previously mentioned Dark Patch item card for easy energy acceleration. Another great card from this set was Dark Claw, a tool card which increases damage done by Darkness type Pokemon by 20. With damage modifiers being very limited and almost non-existent, this was another great addition that put Darkness decks above other archetypes. Up until the release of Dark Explorers, decks featuring Mewtwo EX with its X-Ball attack deals 20 damage for each energy attached to both active Pokemon were dominating the format, but Darkrai EX was able to finally put up a fight against those decks. At first, these decks were mostly based on just Darkrai EX and a variety of support Pokemon to ensure setup and alternative game plans. But when the format started developing, players quickly realized that there was no reason to just not combine it with other powerful basic attackers to cover different matchups. This is where arguably the most powerful variant was born. By combining the 2 best cards of the format, Darkrai EX and Mewtwo EX formed an incredibly powerful duo that was able to overrun almost any other deck. And thanks to the 2 typings of Psychic and Darkness, wasn't susceptible to weaknesses for the most part. This was taken even a step further in the 2012 World Championships, where Terrakion from Noble Victories got added to the mix. Its Retaliation attack deals 30 damage for 1 fighting and 1 colorless energy, but if any of your Pokemon were knocked out during the last turn, it deals an extra 60 damage. This card had already been popular as a counter to Darkrai EX thanks to its fighting type, but it also helped this deck in particular provide it with one prize alternative attacker to prevent your opponent from winning after knocking out 3 of your EX Pokemon. Throughout the next season, Darkrai EX slowly had to give up some of its dominance because multiple attackers were introduced to the game that could knock it out relatively easy, while Darkrai EX's strength never lied in picking up one-hit knockouts but setting up the board and winning on speed and consistency. This was by no means the end for it, however, as it adapted into a different new archetypes that would be better suited for the new metagame. One popular deck featured a card that we already talked about with Yveltal EX, Garbodor from Dragons Exalted. Its Garbotoxin ability was a perfect tech for Darkrai EX to combat these new one-hit knockout decks by slowing down the game, as all of them required abilities to get their attackers going. To many players' surprise, a different version of the deck ended up as the highest placing Darkrai EX deck in the 2013 World Championships. This deck relied fully on Darkrai EX's Night Spear attack, just like when the deck first came out. From that point onward, it went downhill very quickly for Darkrai EX as an attacker. By the time the 2014 World Championships came around, it had almost fully been degraded to a support option for decks that were running Darkness energies, or any kind of special energies that could provide it, such as Prism Energy, a special energy card that provides the basic Pokemon it is attached to with any type of basic energy. This was nowhere near the end for Darkrai EX though, as it still sees play as support Pokemon in these kinds of decks to this day in the expanded format, more than 11 years after its initial release, showing how powerful its Dark Cloak ability is as a utility option. And at number 5, we have Shiftry from Black and White Next Destinies. This card has the ability Giant Fan, which has the effect that when this card is evolved from your hand, you can flip a coin, and if heads, you get to shuffle one of your opponent's Pokemon back into their deck. Now, normally an effect like this wouldn't be very notable because it's a Stage 2 Pokemon, and you'd have to wait 2 turns before even able to evolve into a Shiftry. Well, that's where Forest of Giant Plants comes into play. The Stadium card allows you to evolve grass Pokemon on the turn they're played without having to wait a turn. And even though Shiftry is a dark Pokemon, it does have a grass basic and a stage 1 version available to it, which allow you to make full use of Forest to evolve into Shiftry from your hand immediately on your first turn, assuming you have the combo pieces. And it was thanks to Forest of Giant Plants that Shiftry was able to enable turn 1 wins by shuffling all of your opponent's starting Pokemon back into their deck. Now, while this combo wasn't the most consistent on its own, since it required 4 specific cards to even get the ball rolling, and required you to win a coin flip to even land the effect, if you simply filled your deck with nothing but draw power and scoop up items, you could pull off a Shiftry over and over on your first turn until eventually you got enough heads to shuffle back all of your opponent's Pokemon. Players using this deck would even use Scoop Up Cyclone as their A-Spec card, which you're only allowed to have 1 copy total in your deck, just to get Shiftry back in their hand to try again. Eventually, this deck became enough of a menace that they banned Shiftry in the expanded format only 1 month after Forest was added to the game, before eventually Forest of Giant Plants itself was banned for enabling other combo decks, and Shiftry was released from the ban list. Generally, Pokemon as a card game does not have turn 1 win conditions, so the fact that Shiftry enabled one of the very few in the history of the games gives it a spot on this list. And at number 4, we've got Sableye from Black and White Dark Explorers. For 1 colorless energy, its Confuse Ray attack deals 10 damage and leaves your opponent's active Pokemon confused if you flip heads. Confuse is a condition where a Pokemon has to flip a heads to attack or else it takes 30 damage instead. Junk Hunt requires 1 darkness energy and lets you pick up 2 item cards in your discard pile and put them into your hand. When Sableye first came out, it was included in the aforementioned Darkrai EX decks, usually to recover a card like Dark Patch or Pokemon Catcher. An item card for Emerging Powers lets you switch one of your opponent's bench Pokemon with their active Pokemon, back then without requiring a flip. Another card that was often seen in decks that purely focus on Darkrai EX as their attacker was Crushing Hammer. An item card lets you flip a coin, and if heads, discard an energy card attached to one of your opponent's Pokemon. Sableye could recover it multiple times and heavily slow down your opponent, or, in extreme cases, even run out of energy entirely. For the near future, Sableye would remain a support card in various darkness type decks to recover valuable items as they kept getting better until eventually in 2015, Sableye would finally become the star of the show in its own dedicated deck. In 2016, Sableye in combination with Garbodor from XY Breakpoint became an incredibly powerful control deck in the expanded format, largely thanks to the Puzzle of Time item card from the same set. When played individually, this card lets you look at the top 3 cards of your deck and put them back in any order. But if 2 of them were played at the same time, you get to recover any 2 cards from your discard pile and put them back into your hand. Since Sableye gets to recover 2 item cards per turn, this would allow the player to recover any 2 cards each turn, and since the expanded format goes back all the way to Black and White, there is an incredible amount of powerful cards that can be recovered. First and foremost, the ace-back card Life Dew. Life Dew is a tool card that, when attached to a Pokemon that's knocked out, reduces the amount of prize cards your opponent takes by 1. Since Sableye is a 1-prize Pokemon, this means that your opponent doesn't get to take any prize cards. Before Puzzle of Time was released, players had already tried to make this deck work. But the recurrent issue was the fact that every second turn, your opponent got to take a prize card as Sableye could only recover Life Dew once it entered the discard pile. Now, Life Dew could always be recovered immediately thanks to Puzzle of Time. Other cards that were great to recover were the mini disruption item and supporter cards, or recovery cards for Sableye and Darkness Energy to ensure that you would never run out of attackers. Eventually, Puzzle Time became too much of a problem in the format that TPCI decided to ban it, as it was going to get even more problematic once more powerful cards were released. While Sableye got to stay in the format at first, it also got banned later down the line when almost every card was banned and expanded that could cause infinite resource loops as they were becoming too powerful. If not banned, it would probably still see play expanded to this day, as recovering 2 item cards every turn will never not be incredibly powerful. And at number 3, we have Sableye from Diamond and Pearl Stormfront. This Pokemon is a rare case where both of its attacks and its special ability contributed to its success over the years. Its ability Overeager allowed you to go first if it was your active Pokemon at the start of the game. Its Impersonate attack caused 0 energy and allowed you to copy the effect of a supporter card from your deck. And Overconfident for only 1 Darkness energy did 40 damage to Pokemon with less HP than itself. During the time this card came out, you could still attack on your first turn, as well as use abilities and attach energies. So if you attached a special Darkness energy to Sableye, which increased its damage by 10, you could actually knock out a vast majority of basic Pokemon at the time on your first turn, as most of them only had around 50 HP. And if they did have more than 50 HP, you could lower it by 10 with Crobat G's Flash Bite ability, which simply required you to play Crobat to your bench to activate it. And if your opponent was unlucky enough to only have 1 Pokemon in play, you could end the game right then and there on your first turn. And this ability was on top of the card being great even without trying for a turn 1 win, as most people who used the card didn't even play Darkness Energy and just cared about the ability to go first or use an extra supporter card to set up combos. In second place, we've got Sneasel from Neo Genesis, which also makes it by far the oldest card on our list. Its Fury Swipes attacks flips 2 coins and deals 10 damage for each heads. Beat Up requires 2 Darkness Energy and flips a coin for each of your Pokemon in play. This attack does 20 damage times the number of heads. While it may not look like it, comparatively speaking, Sneasel is actually the most powerful basic Pokemon that the game has ever seen. Sneasel decks always included a lot of basic Pokemon, so filling up the bench to get the maximum number of 6 flips for Beat Up was never really an issue. This meant that it would average 60 damage per attack, which was enough to knock out most other Pokemon, especially when considering that this was still the time when Darkness type attacks cost could only be fulfilled by special Darkness Energy, which would also add 10 damage each for both of the energies now attached to Sneasel, putting the average damage that Sneasel did to 80, which was definitely enough for most Pokemon at the time. Not only did it come with the most powerful attack at the time, but it also had no weakness, free retreat, and a minus 30 resistance to Psychic, which was a relevant type at the time. When Sneasel first got released, something like a standard or modified format didn't exist, as there simply weren't enough sets at the time for it to make sense to exclude some of them. Players were using cards like Energy Removal from base set, an item card that discards an energy attached to one of your opponent's Pokemon to combat Sneasel and make sure that it wouldn't be able to attack, which was especially powerful considering that only 4 special Darkness energies could be played per deck, and Energy Removal wasn't the only card that discarded energies, and could even be recycled from the discard pile. This scenario changed in 2001 when the first ever rotation of Pokemon TCG happened. Cards from Team Rocket until Neo Genesis were now legal for tournament play, and absolutely nothing would stand in the way of Sneasel's complete dominance. Even with Energy Removal in mind, it had been dominating the most recent format, so letting it loose on the format without it would be devastating. There was, however, one thing that could stop Sneasel from its dominance, and that was Wizards of the Coast, the company in charge of Pokemon TCG at the time. Realizing how incredibly powerful Sneasel would have been going forward, it was hit with the first ever ban in the Pokemon TCG, and without mistranslations or cards that weren't intended for tournament play in the first place, would remain so until 14 years later, when the next card got banned in the standard format. To this day, only 4 cards have ever been banned in standard format of the Pokemon TCG, because they were too powerful or unhealthy for the game, with Sneasel being the only card that got banned for having too powerful an attack. And finally, at number 1, we have Zoroark GX. This is probably one of the strongest Pokemon ever printed, simply because of its special ability, Trade, which allowed you to, once per turn per copy, discard 1 card to draw 2 cards. Being able to just cycle through your deck and go +1 for basically free every turn is just useful in all kinds of scenarios and decks. If you're trying to set up a combo, stall, or build up an attacker, all of these strategies benefit from being able to go +1 each turn for basically free. On top of that, it also had a useful attack in Riotous Beating, which dealt 20 damage times the number of Pokemon you had in play. So if you had a full bench, it would do 120 damage for 2 energy. And since this attack used 2 colorless energy, you could power it with basically any deck you were using. In fact, most decks that ran this card could never even use its GX attack simply because they didn't play Darkness energies at all. Alright, and that's the list. This video had to have a few re-edits to change some portions because our previous scriptwriter thought it was okay to copy their past work verbatim, and I had to rewrite the affected sections myself. In other news, we'll be hiring a new scriptwriter for this channel in the coming weeks. Make sure to follow my Twitter in the video description for updates on when we officially open up listings.